There are places on this earth that have been closed off, sealed away, and forgotten by the rest of the world. Places where the doors have been locked, the fences have gone up, and humanity has simply been told to stay out. Some of these places were abandoned because of disease, others because of war, natural disaster, or something far stranger and harder to explain. Tonight, we are going to visit these forbidden corners of the world, and we're going to find out exactly why no one is allowed to go back. Somewhere in the waters off the coast of Venice, Italy, if you look south from the famous Piazza San Marco, you might notice a small island sitting alone in the lagoon. It doesn't look like much from a distance, just a cluster of crumbling buildings and a solitary bell tower poking through the overgrowth. But the locals know it well, and most of them won't go anywhere near it. In fact, fishermen have been known to steer wide of this island for generations, and if a bone or skull happens to get tangled in their nets, they throw the entire catch back into the water without a second thought. They say that when an evil man dies, he wakes up on Poveglia, and while that is a saying rooted in local superstition, the truth about what happened on this island is in many ways worse than anything folklore could conjure. Poveglia Island has existed in historical records since at least 421 AD, when the earliest known reference to the island appears in documents from the late Roman period. In those early centuries, the island served primarily as a Roman military outpost, a small strategic foothold in the lagoon. During the 9th century, refugees from the mainland cities of Padua and Este settled there, fleeing the barbarian invasions that were tearing through the Italian peninsula. For a time, a small community of fishermen and farmers lived quiet lives on its shores. They traded salt, caught fish in the warm waters of the lagoon, and raised families in relative peace. The community grew modestly, and for several centuries, Poveglia was simply another small island in the Venetian lagoon, unremarkable in every way. But when Genoa launched its assault on Venice in 1379, the residents of Poveglia found themselves caught in the crossfire. They fled to the nearby island of Giudecca, abandoning their homes and their livelihoods, and after the conflict ended, no one came back. The island sat empty for over a century, its buildings slowly crumbling, its fields returning to wild grass, its name gradually fading from conversation. It stayed that way, slowly decaying, slowly being forgotten, until something far worse than war came calling. In the late 1700s, the bubonic plague tore through Europe once again. Venice, being one of the most important trading ports in the world at the time, was especially vulnerable. Ships arrived from every corner of the known world carrying goods, passengers, and invisible passengers of a different kind, the bacteria that caused the Black Death. Venetian officials, desperate to keep the plague from consuming the city, turned to the islands in their lagoon as quarantine stations. And Poveglia was one of them. The logic was brutally simple. If someone showed symptoms, or even if they had merely traveled from an infected region, they were pulled from their homes, loaded onto boats, and sent to the island. There was no treatment waiting for them. There was no cure. There was only isolation, and for most, there was death. The scale of the suffering that took place on Poveglia is almost impossible to comprehend. Over the course of its years as a quarantine station, an estimated 100,000 to 160,000 people are believed to have died on the island. The dead were stacked in pits dug into the earth. When those pits filled up, the bodies were set on fire. When the fires couldn't keep pace with the mounting dead, living patients were sometimes thrown onto the pyres alongside the corpses, too sick and too weak to resist. The air hung thick with the smell of burning flesh, and the smoke could be seen from Venice itself. It has been said that roughly half of the soil on Poveglia is composed of human ash and bone, the literal remains of tens of thousands of plague victims ground into the earth over centuries. Whether that exact figure is accurate or not, what is certain is that the island became a graveyard on a staggering scale. But the horrors of Poveglia didn't end with the plague. In 1922, long after the quarantine station had been closed, the remaining buildings on the island were converted into a psychiatric hospital. In those days, mental illness was poorly understood, and the patients sent to Poveglia were often people whose only crime was behaving outside the narrow cultural norms of the time. People with physical disabilities, neurological conditions, or simply personalities that didn't conform were sent to the island to be dealt with out of sight and out of mind. According to widespread accounts, the doctor who ran the facility performed horrific experiments on the patients. Lobotomies were carried out using crude tools like chisels and hammers, without anesthesia or even basic hygiene. Patients were subjected to electroshock treatments with no oversight. The conditions were described as barbaric and torturous. According to legend, this doctor eventually went mad himself. Some say the ghosts of his own victims drove him to insanity. Whatever the cause, the story goes that he climbed to the top of the island's bell tower and threw himself off, falling to his death. Whether the details of this particular legend are entirely accurate has been debated, and some researchers have noted that elements of the story may have originated from American television productions rather than verified historical records. But what is not disputed is that the hospital closed in 1968, and after that, the island was abandoned completely. Today, Poveglia Island remains off-limits to the general public. The Italian government owns the property, and visiting requires a special permit that is rarely granted. The crumbling buildings are unsafe, with collapsed stairways, rotting floors, and vegetation that has consumed nearly every structure. In 2014, the government auctioned off a 99-year lease on the island, and an Italian businessman won with a bid of roughly 513,000 euros. He reportedly planned to invest millions in restoration, but as of now, nothing has come of those plans. The island remains exactly as it has been for decades, abandoned, decaying, and silent, except for the stories that refuse to die. Fishermen still avoid the waters. Visitors who have managed to reach the island report hearing sounds that have no source, screams that echo from empty buildings, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. One particularly persistent account describes the apparition of a young girl crying out for her parents along the water's edge. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the sheer weight of suffering that took place on Poveglia is enough to make anyone's skin crawl. And speaking of islands that the world has decided to leave alone, if Poveglia is an island haunted by the dead, then there is another island off the coast of Brazil that is very much haunted by the living, although what lives there is arguably even more terrifying than any ghost. Ilha da Queimada Grande sits roughly 33 kilometers off the coast of São Paulo, Brazil, in the warm waters of the Atlantic. It's a small island, only about 43 hectares in area, with terrain that varies from exposed bare rock to patches of dense rainforest. From a distance, it looks like any other lush tropical outcrop in the Atlantic Ocean, the kind of place where you might imagine white sand beaches and palm trees swaying in the breeze. The name itself, which translates roughly to Big Burned Island, comes from a practice the Brazilian Navy once employed of setting fire to the island's vegetation in an attempt to clear the land and reduce encounters with its most notorious residents. But no amount of burning could solve the problem, and there is a reason the Brazilian government has made it illegal for any civilian to set foot on this island. That reason has scales, and it has venom that can kill you in under an hour. Roughly 11,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, rising sea levels separated this island from the Brazilian mainland. Whatever species of snake had been living on the island at the time was suddenly cut off, trapped on this small piece of rock with no ground-level predators to keep its population in check, but also no ground-level prey to eat. Over thousands of years of evolution, these snakes adapted. They climbed into the trees. They began hunting the migratory birds that visited the island during their seasonal flights. And because a bird can simply fly away after being bitten, unlike a rodent that can be tracked on the ground, the snakes evolved venom of extraordinary potency. The result is the golden lancehead pit viper, a species that exists nowhere else on Earth. Its venom is estimated to be 3 to 5 times stronger than that of any mainland snake in its genus, and it is capable of causing kidney failure, brain hemorrhaging, necrosis of muscle tissue, intestinal bleeding, and in many cases, death within an hour. Current estimates suggest that between 2,000 and 4,000 of these vipers inhabit the island, concentrated primarily in the rainforest areas. Previous estimates had placed the number far higher, with some claiming up to 430,000 snakes, though systematic population studies have brought the figure down considerably. Still, the density is staggering. Some researchers have described encountering one snake for every few square meters in certain parts of the island. The golden lancehead is also critically endangered, found exclusively on this one small island, which adds an additional layer of complexity to the situation. The Brazilian Navy has closed the island entirely. The only people allowed to visit are researchers who have been vetted and approved by the Chico Mendes Institute for Biodiversity Conservation, and even they are required to have a doctor present on every expedition, just in case someone gets bitten. Local legends tell grim tales of those who ventured to the island before the ban. One of the most commonly repeated stories involves a fisherman who landed on the island in search of bananas. According to the tale, he was later found dead in his boat, adrift at sea, his body covered in snake bites and surrounded by a pool of his own blood. Another story describes the fate of the last lighthouse keeper and his family, who were supposedly killed when snakes entered their living quarters through the windows. The lighthouse, which was built in 1909, has been automated since the 1920s, and the Brazilian Navy makes an annual visit to maintain it, but no one lives on the island. Despite the ban, the golden lancehead has attracted the attention of wildlife smugglers, known in Brazil as biopirates, who have been known to make illegal trips to the island to capture the snakes. On the black market, a single golden lancehead can fetch between $10,000 and $30,000, driven largely by demand from collectors and from scientists interested in the pharmaceutical potential of the snake's venom, which has shown promise in treating heart disease and blood clots. While the venom of the golden lancehead is the stuff of nightmares, the island itself stands as a haunting reminder of what happens when nature is left to its own devices in complete isolation. It's beautiful in a way, but the beauty is laced with danger at every turn, and unless you're a scientist with nerves of steel and a very good reason to be there, the island will remain exactly what it has been for thousands of years. A place where humans are not welcome. Now, if we travel from the waters off the coast of Brazil to the waters off the coast of a very different kind of place. We arrive at one of the most eerily abandoned locations in the United States. A place hiding in plain sight, just a stone's throw from one of the most densely populated cities on the planet. North Brother Island sits in the East River in New York City, nestled between the Bronx and Rikers Island. It is only about 20 acres in size, and despite being close enough to Manhattan that you could practically wave at it, the island has been completely abandoned since 1963, and it is strictly off-limits to the public. The New York City Parks Department, which oversees the island, rarely grants permission to visit, and when it does, it is only for what they call compelling academic or scientific purposes. Every visitor must be escorted by a park staff member, and those visitors are only allowed during a narrow window in the fall after the bird mating season has ended and before the harshness of winter sets in. The island was uninhabited until 1885, when New York City purchased it and built Riverside Hospital there. This was not a hospital in the way most people think of one. Riverside was specifically designed to isolate and treat patients suffering from the most feared contagious diseases of the era, including smallpox, tuberculosis, typhus, and yellow fever. The idea was to take the sickest and most contagious individuals and put them somewhere that they could not infect anyone else. And for a place meant to contain disease, North Brother Island certainly saw its share of tragedy. The island's most famous resident was a woman named Mary Mallon, who would become known to history as Typhoid Mary. Born in Ireland in 1869, Mallon immigrated to the United States and eventually found work as a cook in wealthy New York households. The problem was that Mary was an asymptomatic carrier of the bacteria that causes typhoid fever. She carried the disease in her body without ever showing symptoms herself, but everywhere she worked, people got sick. Between 1900 and 1907, family after family fell ill with typhoid after hiring Mary. A sanitary engineer named George Soper was eventually brought in to investigate, and he traced the outbreaks directly to her. In 1907, after resisting capture and refusing to believe she was infected, Mary was forcibly taken to North Brother Island and quarantined at Riverside Hospital. She was held there for 3 years, living in a small cottage next to the hospital. In 1910, she was released under the strict condition that she would never work as a cook again. Mary ignored the order. She changed her name to Mary Brown, found work as a cook at the Sloan Maternity Hospital, and within months, 25 people were infected with typhoid, and 2 of them died. Mary was captured again in 1915 and returned to North Brother Island. This time, she would never leave. She remained quarantined on the island for the next 23 years until her death from pneumonia in 1938. During her decades of isolation, she worked in the hospital laboratory and spent her time baking cakes and making jewelry from beads. But Typhoid Mary is only part of the island's dark history. 3 years before Mary arrived, on June 15, 1904, a steamship called the P.S. General Slocum caught fire while carrying a church group, mostly women and children of the German immigrant community from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, on what was supposed to be a joyful picnic excursion to a beach on Long Island. The ship carried roughly 1,300 passengers, nearly all of them members of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church. As the General Slocum steamed up the East River, a fire broke out in a storage room. The crew was untrained and unprepared. The fire hoses were rotten and burst when they were turned on. The life preservers, which had been hanging on the ship for years without inspection, disintegrated when passengers tried to use them, some reportedly filled with cheap cork that had crumbled to dust and iron bars that actually dragged people underwater. The lifeboats were painted into their davits and could not be freed. The captain, William Henry Van Schaik, made the fateful decision to keep the ship moving rather than pulling to shore, which only fanned the flames. The burning vessel eventually ran aground near North Brother Island, and the staff at Riverside Hospital rushed to the shore to help pull survivors from the water. But for most of those aboard, it was too late. Over 1,000 people died that day, either from the fire itself or from drowning in the swift currents of the East River. Many of the victims were women and children who had never learned to swim, weighed down by the heavy clothing of the era. It was the deadliest disaster in New York City history until September 11th, 2001. The bodies washed ashore on North Brother Island for hours and days afterward, lining the beaches in rows. For decades, residents of the island reported seeing the ghosts of the Slocum victims wandering the grounds at night, weeping for the lives they had lost. After the hospital closed in the early 1940s, the island was briefly repurposed as housing for World War II veterans attending college on the GI Bill. Then in the 1950s, it was transformed yet again into a rehabilitation center for teenage drug addicts, a program that ultimately failed. In 1963, the island was abandoned entirely, and nature began its slow reclamation. Today, the buildings are consumed by trees and vines. Ivy climbs through shattered windows, roots push through concrete floors, and the old tuberculosis pavilion is in such a state of decay that its roof has caved in entirely. The island has become a sanctuary for nesting shorebirds, including black-crowned night herons and various species of egret. It is a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary sadness, a forgotten ruin hiding in the shadow of one of the world's greatest cities. From an island consumed by nature in the middle of New York City, we now travel across the world to a place where an entire city was consumed not by trees and vines, but by something far more insidious, something invisible and deadly. On April 26, 1986, a catastrophic explosion ripped through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in what was then the Soviet Union, now Ukraine. It was the worst nuclear disaster in history and one of only 2 events ever classified as a level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The explosion released a cloud of radioactive contamination that drifted across large swaths of the Soviet Union and Europe, and the consequences were immediate and devastating. Just 3 kilometers from the reactor sat the city of Pripyat, a model Soviet city that had been built in 1970 specifically to house the workers of the Chernobyl plant. At the time of the disaster, roughly 50,000 people lived there, and the average age of the population was just 26. Pripyat was a city of young families, with a new amusement park that had been scheduled to open on May 1st for the annual May Day celebrations. There was a cinema, a gymnasium, a swimming pool, schools, and a hotel. It was, by Soviet standards, a showcase of modern urban life. But when the reactor exploded in the early hours of that April morning, the Soviet authorities initially tried to conceal the scale of the disaster. The residents of Pripyat were not immediately informed of the danger. Many of them stood on a railway bridge overlooking the reactor that night, watching the eerie glow of the exposed core and the shimmering particles in the air, not realizing they were staring directly at lethal levels of radiation. Some of those people would be dead within weeks. It was not until the following afternoon, April 27th, that buses arrived to evacuate the city. Residents were told to bring only a single suitcase. They were told they would return in a few days. They never did. On May 2nd, 1986, the Soviet government officially established the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, a restricted area spanning roughly 2,600 square kilometers around the damaged reactor. Within weeks, approximately 116,000 people were relocated, a number that would eventually grow to over 200,000 as the full extent of the contamination became clear. The exclusion zone swallowed not only Pripyat, but 187 smaller communities across the surrounding countryside, all of which were permanently abandoned. Today, the exclusion zone remains one of the most surreal and haunting places on the planet. It is a landscape that seems pulled from the pages of a post-apocalyptic novel, except that it is entirely real. The abandoned villages in the outer zone, scattered through the forests and marshlands that make up the heartland of the Poveglia region, are being swallowed by nature. Houses still contain clothing, children's toys, and Soviet-era newspapers scattered among the rooms, all left behind in the frantic rush to evacuate. The larger town of Chernobyl itself, which dates back to the 12th century and once had a vibrant community with a large Jewish population, is now a ghostly administrative center where the few remaining workers in the zone live in basic dormitories on strict rotation schedules, 15 days inside the zone, 15 days outside, to keep their radiation exposure within acceptable limits. But it is Pripyat that draws the most attention, and rightly so. The city is frozen in time. The apartment buildings still stand, their windows shattered, their interiors slowly crumbling. Inside the schools, textbooks and children's shoes litter the floors. In one famous room, hundreds of gas masks are scattered across the ground, relics of a Cold War education program that trained students to prepare for a nuclear attack from the West, an irony that is almost too painful to process. The amusement park that was never opened still stands in the center of the city, its Ferris wheel and bumper cars rusted and motionless, icons of a celebration that never came. Trees grow through the concrete of the streets. Wild animals, including wolves, deer, and wild boar, roam freely through the ruins, reclaiming a space that humans were forced to abandon. Visitors are allowed into parts of the exclusion zone on guided tours, and before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, tens of thousands of tourists visited each year. But much of the zone, particularly the area closest to the reactor and the basements of certain buildings like the hospital in Pripyat, remains dangerously radioactive. Visitors must pass through strict military-style checkpoints, present their passports, and be screened for radiation upon departure. Taking anything out of the zone is forbidden, and guides have had to warn tourists against behaviors like licking trees, eating wild berries, or rolling around on the ground for photographs. The reactor itself is now enclosed within a massive structure called the New Safe Confinement, built to contain the remaining radiation for the next 100 years. Despite the efforts to manage the aftermath, around 200 elderly residents known as samosli, which translates roughly to self-settlers, illegally returned to their homes within the exclusion zone in the years following the disaster. These were mostly retired individuals, people who had spent their entire lives in the villages of the Poveglia region, who found the idea of dying far from home more frightening than the invisible threat of radiation. They chose the familiarity of a contaminated home over the strangeness of a new one, and most of them lived out the rest of their lives in the quiet, radioactive countryside, tending gardens, keeping chickens, and surviving primarily through subsistence farming and care packages delivered by the occasional visitor. Their presence in the zone was technically illegal, but the authorities largely turned a blind eye, perhaps recognizing that the harm had already been done, and that no law could force these people to abandon the only home they had ever loved. While Chernobyl's exclusion zone is the result of a single catastrophic event, there is a place in the United States where disaster didn't strike all at once, but crept slowly, insidiously from beneath the ground, consuming an entire town over the course of decades. And it's still happening right now as you listen to this. Centralia, Pennsylvania was once a small but lively coal mining town in Columbia County, about 2 hours northwest of Philadelphia. Coal was first mined in the area in 1842, and by the early 20th century, the town had over a dozen active mines and a population of roughly 2,500 people. It was a hardscrabble community, built on the dangerous but lucrative work of pulling anthracite coal from deep underground. But by the mid-20th century, the coal industry was in decline, and most of Centralia's mines had been abandoned, leaving behind a vast labyrinth of empty tunnels stretching for miles beneath the town. In May of 1962, the Centralia Borough Council decided to clean up the local landfill, which was located in an abandoned strip mine pit near the Oddfellows Cemetery, just outside the town limits. The pit itself was a relic of the mining era, roughly 300 feet wide, 75 feet long, and about 50 feet deep, excavated by a miner named Edward Whitney back in 1935. By the early 1960s, it had become one of several illegal dumping sites in the area, and the council's intention in consolidating trash into this one location was to address the growing problem of unregulated garbage dumps scattered around the town. Pennsylvania had actually passed a law in 1956 specifically to regulate the use of abandoned strip mines as landfills, precisely because they were known to be fire hazards. The law required permits and regular inspections, but Centralia had fallen behind on compliance, and the barrier of fire-resistant clay that was supposed to be installed between layers of trash had never been properly maintained. The method the council chose for cleaning up the landfill was the same one they had used in previous years. They hired 5 members of the volunteer fire company, set the garbage on fire, and let it burn. In previous years, when the landfill had been in a different location, this had worked without incident. But on May 27, 1962, things went catastrophically wrong. What happened next would change the town forever. Through an unsealed opening in the pit, the fire found its way into the abandoned coal mines below. The rich veins of anthracite coal, which need very little encouragement to ignite, caught fire underground. Attempts were made to put out the fire, but the network of tunnels was so vast and so interconnected that it was impossible to determine exactly where the fire was burning or how far it had spread. Each attempt to excavate and extinguish the fire failed, either because of insufficient funding or because the fire had already moved beyond the area being targeted. For years, the residents of Centralia lived with the fire smoldering beneath their feet. They complained of foul odors seeping into their homes, of headaches, burning eyes, and the acrid taste of sulfur on their tongues. Wisps of smoke curled from cracks in the ground. In some areas, the surface temperature reached over 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground itself became unstable, prone to sudden collapse as the coal beneath was consumed. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was walking through his grandmother's backyard when the ground suddenly opened beneath him, creating a sinkhole that dropped into the burning mine below. The boy managed to grab a tree root and was pulled to safety by his cousin, but the incident made national headlines and brought the reality of Centralia's crisis into sharp focus. In 1984, Congress allocated more than $42 million for the voluntary relocation of Centralia's residents. Most accepted the buyout and left. In 1992, the governor of Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain on all properties in the borough, condemning every building. In 2002, the United States Postal Service discontinued Centralia's zip code. One by one, the buildings were demolished, the streets emptied, and the town was erased from the map. By 2010, only 5 occupied homes remained, their residents stubborn holdouts who refused to leave the only homes they had ever known. In 2013, a settlement was reached, allowing the remaining residents to stay for the rest of their lives, after which their properties would be seized. Today, Centralia is a near ghost town. The fire, which has been burning for over 60 years, now covers roughly 400 acres and extends as deep as 300 feet underground. It is advancing along 4 separate fronts at a rate of about 75 feet per year. Experts estimate that there is enough coal beneath Centralia to fuel the fire for another 250 years. The abandoned stretch of Pennsylvania Route 61, which once ran through the center of town, is now a cracked and buckled ribbon of asphalt covered in graffiti, with steam rising from fissures in the pavement. Signs warn of underground fire, unstable ground, and dangerous carbon monoxide levels. The few remaining homes sit in isolation, surrounded by empty lots and new-growth forest. The town's only surviving church, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a Ukrainian Catholic church, still holds weekly services. A geological survey determined that it sits on solid rock rather than coal, so it is not in danger of collapse. Centralia, the real-life inspiration for the fog-shrouded town in the Silent Hill films, is a place where the ground itself has become the enemy, and the fire that burns beneath it is a problem that no one alive today will ever see resolved. From a town being consumed from below, we travel now to the eastern Mediterranean, to an abandoned resort city on the island of Cyprus that was once considered the Riviera of the eastern Mediterranean, a sun-drenched playground for the rich and famous that was abandoned overnight and has remained frozen in time for over 50 years. Before 1974, the beach district of Varosha in the Cypriot city of Famagusta was one of the most glamorous tourist destinations in the world. Its golden sand beaches stretched along the coast, lined with high-rise hotels, luxury resorts, restaurants, and nightclubs. Celebrities like Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Brigitte Bardot, and Raquel Welch vacationed there. In 1970, the future members of the Swedish pop group ABBA performed an informal show for Swedish UN peacekeepers stationed on the island, one of the first occasions all 4 members performed together. Famagusta had over 100 hotels, and the guest books in their lobbies were filled with entries right up to August 14, 1974. After that date, there were no more entries, because on that day, the Turkish army arrived. The crisis had been building for years. Ethnic tensions between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots had been simmering since the island gained independence from Britain in 1960. In July of 1974, a coup backed by the military junta in Greece attempted to unite Cyprus with Greece, and Turkey responded with a full-scale military invasion. On August 14th, Turkish forces advanced into Famagusta. The roughly 35,000 Greek Cypriot residents of Varosha fled south in a matter of hours, aided by the nearby British military base. They left everything behind: their homes, their businesses, their cars still parked in driveways, meals still on kitchen tables. They expected to return in a few days. They never did. The Turkish army occupied Varosha, fenced it off with barbed wire, and sealed it shut. For nearly 5 decades, the district was designated a military zone, patrolled by Turkish soldiers and completely off-limits to civilians. United Nations Security Council, Resolution 550, adopted in 1984, declared that attempts to settle any part of Varosha by anyone other than its original inhabitants was inadmissible and called for the area to be transferred to UN control. Turkey has ignored this resolution entirely. The buildings, once gleaming and new, have spent half a century exposed to the elements without maintenance or repair. Facades have peeled like sunburned skin. Balconies have collapsed. Trees have grown through the floors of hotel lobbies. Car dealerships still hold vehicles from the 1970s, their tires flat, their paint faded, their interiors consumed by dust and mold. Along John F. Kennedy Avenue, the main street that once ran through the heart of the resort, the shop signs of businesses that no longer exist anywhere in the world, Olympian Airlines, British European Airways, still hang above empty doorways. It is a time capsule of the 1970s, sealed in decay. In recent years, small sections of Varosha have been partially reopened. Beginning in 2020, visitors were allowed to enter a limited area through a military checkpoint, walking or cycling along repaved streets under the watchful eyes of police and military officers. Caution signs are everywhere, warning that the surrounding buildings could collapse at any moment. But the vast majority of the district remains strictly off-limits, the buildings too dangerous to enter, the political situation too sensitive to resolve. For the thousands of Greek Cypriots who were forced to abandon their homes and businesses in 1974, Varosha remains an open wound. One handwritten note, tied to the wire fence that separates the occupied zone from the rest of the island, reads simply, "I left my soul in there. Open it up." From a city frozen by conflict in the Mediterranean, we travel now across the Pacific Ocean to an island off the coast of Japan that tells a very different story of abandonment. One born not from disaster, but from the rise and fall of industry and the dark chapter of forced labor during wartime. Hashima Island, better known by its nickname Gunkanjima, which translates to Battleship Island, is a tiny speck of rock in the East China Sea, about 15 kilometers from Nagasaki. The island measures barely 480 meters long and 150 meters wide, and from a distance, its silhouette of towering concrete buildings and high sea walls gives it the unmistakable appearance of a warship. It is this resemblance that earned it its famous name. Coal was first discovered on Hashima around 1810, and permanent mining operations began in 1887. In 1890, the Mitsubishi Corporation purchased the island and began an ambitious project to extract coal from undersea mines that stretched deep beneath the ocean floor. The conditions in those mines were brutal, with temperatures reaching 30 degrees Celsius and humidity levels near 95%. But the coal was of exceptional quality, and as Japan's industrial machine grew hungrier, so did Hashima. The island was expanded through land reclamation, tripling its original size, and surrounded by massive seawalls to protect against the typhoons that regularly battered the coast. In 1916, the first large reinforced concrete building was erected on the island, a 9-story apartment block that was among the first of its kind in Japan. More buildings followed: schools, shops, a cinema, a bathhouse, restaurants, and even a rooftop garden were constructed to serve the growing population. At its peak in 1959, Hiroshima was home to 5,259 people, making it one of the most densely populated places on the planet, with roughly 83,500 people per square kilometer. Life on the island was cramped, claustrophobic, and relentless. Apartments were tiny, and the narrow corridors between buildings rarely saw direct sunlight. But the community functioned, and for many residents, the island was simply home. There is, however, a much darker chapter in Hiroshima's history, one that transforms the island from an industrial curiosity into something far more disturbing. During World War II, as Japan expanded its empire across Asia, thousands of Korean and Chinese laborers were brought to the island against their will to work in the mines. The exact number is difficult to determine because many records were destroyed or never kept in the first place. But historians estimate that hundreds and possibly thousands of forced laborers were sent to Hiroshima between 1930 and the end of the war in 1945. The conditions for these workers were beyond inhumane. They were lowered into the dark, suffocating shafts that stretched a kilometer beneath the seabed, where temperatures hovered around 30 degrees Celsius, and the humidity was so intense that the air itself felt like a wet cloth pressed against the face. They worked grueling shifts, often without adequate food, rest, or safety equipment. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and accidents were constant threats. The workers called the island by different names than the ones used by their Japanese overseers. They called it Jail Island. Some called it Hell Island. Estimates suggest that as many as 1,000 people may have died on Hiroshima during this period, though exact numbers are impossible to confirm because many deaths went unrecorded and many bodies were simply disposed of without ceremony. When Hiroshima was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2015 as part of a collection of industrial sites illustrating Japan's rapid modernization, South Korea strongly objected, insisting that Japan acknowledge the history of forced labor. Japan agreed to the condition, but the promised memorials and information centers have been slow to materialize, a point of ongoing tension. In the 1960s, as petroleum replaced coal as Japan's primary energy source, Hiroshima's mines began to falter. Mitsubishi officially closed the mine in January of 1974, and by April of that year, every last resident had departed. The island was sealed off and left to the elements. For more than 3 decades, it was completely off limits, a ghost island slowly crumbling under the assault of wind, rain, and salt. Concrete walls cracked and fell, stairways collapsed. Trees and weeds pushed through the floors of apartments that still held personal belongings, photographs, shoes, broken dishes, all the everyday detritus of lives that had been packed up in a matter of days. Fishermen who sailed near the island at night claimed to see strange flickering lights in buildings that had been without electricity for decades. In 2009, a small section of the island was reopened to tourists, who are allowed to walk along reinforced paths and viewing decks, but are forbidden from entering any of the buildings due to the extreme risk of collapse. The rest of the island, including the residential areas that make up the vast majority of its surface, remains strictly off limits. It is a haunting place, a monument to the relentless pace of industrialization and the human cost that so often accompanies it. From an island abandoned to the slow decay of time and weather, we move now to a place that was abandoned not gradually, but in a single, terrifying moment. A place where an entire city was swallowed by the earth itself. Plymouth was once the capital of Montserrat, a small British overseas territory in the Caribbean Sea. For centuries, it was a charming colonial town of roughly 4,000 residents, with colorful buildings, bustling markets, a deep water port that could accommodate cruise ships, and an airport with a landing strip long enough to handle modern jets. It was the beating heart of the island, the center of its government, its commerce, and its culture. Montserrat itself was sometimes called the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean because of its lush green landscape and its deep historical ties to Ireland, dating back to the 1600s when Irish settlers first arrived on the island. For centuries, the Soufriere Hills volcano loomed above Plymouth, but it had been dormant for roughly 300 years, and no one alive had any memory of it being anything other than a scenic backdrop. That changed on July 18, 1995, when the volcano roared back to life. The initial eruption sent ash and debris raining down across the southern part of the island, including Plymouth. Volcanologists warned that the capital was in grave danger. Over the following months, the city was evacuated 3 times as volcanic activity escalated. The first evacuation came in August of 1995. Residents returned in September. The second came in December. Residents returned again in January. The third and final evacuation came on April 3, 1996, when pyroclastic flows and mud flows began occurring with terrifying regularity. This time, there would be no return. In June of 1997, a devastating eruption sent pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, rock, and ash, traveling at over 100 kilometers per hour and reaching temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, tearing down the mountainside and into the surrounding communities. The flows followed the natural channels of the ravines, called ghats in the local dialect, but in some cases spilled out beyond these channels and consumed everything in their path. 19 people who had remained in areas that had been officially evacuated were killed. The tragedy was a turning point. Whatever hope remained that Plymouth might one day be reoccupied evaporated in the scorching heat of that June day. And then, in August of 1997, the worst came. Between August 4th and 8th, a series of massive eruptions buried approximately 80% of Plymouth under layers of volcanic material up to 1.4 meters deep. In some areas, the deposits reached depths of 12 meters or more, burying entire buildings completely. The material was dense and compact, with a consistency similar to that of concrete, making removal practically impossible without explosives and heavy machinery that the island simply could not afford. The intense heat of the pyroclastic flows scorched the soil beneath the volcanic debris, rendering it completely barren and unable to support any kind of agriculture for the foreseeable future. The government ordered a final, complete evacuation, with the Royal Navy assisting in transporting the remaining population to safety. The entire southern half of Montserrat was declared an exclusion zone and permanently sealed off. Today, Plymouth holds the distinction of being the only ghost town that serves as the de jure capital of a political territory. It has never been officially replaced, though the village of Braids in the northern part of the island serves as the de facto seat of government. The town is buried and broken, a modern-day Pompeii in the Caribbean. Church steeples and the tops of clock towers poke above the sea of hardened ash. The roofs of buildings have collapsed under the weight of volcanic debris. Curtains hang tattered in shattered windows. The exclusion zone is heavily restricted, and visitors may only enter with special government permission, a licensed guide, and under strict safety protocols. Visitors must remain near a running vehicle at all times, and the guide must carry a radio in case an emergency evacuation is required. A massive ridge of volcanic material, precariously perched on the slopes above the buried city, is considered a ticking time bomb. If it collapses, whether from an earthquake or further volcanic activity, anyone in the area would have only minutes to escape. The Montserrat Volcano Observatory monitors the volcano continuously, and volcanic gas emissions, including 350 tons of sulfur dioxide per day, continue to pour from the dome. 2/3 of the island's population fled in the years following the eruptions, with many resettling in the United Kingdom. The population, which once stood at 15,000, dropped to fewer than 1,200 at its lowest point, though it has since recovered to around 5,000. From the ash-covered ruins of a Caribbean capital, we travel to what may be the most forbidden place on the planet, an island where the danger doesn't come from the land or the air, but from the people who live there, people who have made it violently clear that the outside world is not welcome. North Sentinel Island lies in the Bay of Bengal, part of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, an Indian archipelago stretching between India and Southeast Asia. The island is roughly the size of Manhattan, covered in dense forest, and surrounded by a coral reef that makes approach by boat treacherous. It has no roads, no ports, and no modern infrastructure of any kind. It is home to the Sentinelese, one of the last remaining uncontacted tribes on Earth, a people who have lived in complete isolation from the rest of humanity for an estimated 60,000 years. Almost nothing is known about the Sentinelese. Their language has never been translated. Their customs, beliefs, and social structures remain a mystery. Researchers estimate their population at somewhere between 50 and 200 individuals, though even this is little more than an educated guess based on observations made from helicopters and boats at a distance. They appear to be hunter-gatherers, surviving by fishing in the lagoons and along the reef, hunting wild pigs with bows and arrows, and gathering plants from the dense forest interior. They build outrigger canoes for lagoon fishing, propelling them with long poles rather than paddles. They do not appear to practice agriculture or to have the ability to make fire, though this too is uncertain. What is known, however, is that they do not want visitors, and they have been willing to kill to enforce that boundary. The Indian government has recognized this, and under the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation of 1956, travel to North Sentinel Island and within 5 nautical miles of its shore is strictly prohibited. The exclusion zone is patrolled by the Indian Navy and Coast Guard, who conduct regular circumnavigation missions to monitor the tribe's welfare from a distance without making contact. The earliest recorded mention of the island dates to 1771, when an East India Company survey vessel noted lights on the shore but did not investigate. The first significant contact came in 1867, when an Indian merchant ship called the Nineveh ran aground on the reef. The crew and passengers made it to shore safely, but on their 3rd day there, they were attacked by a group of islanders armed with arrows. They fought off the attack and were eventually rescued by a passing ship. In the decades that followed, the British colonial government made occasional attempts to establish contact, with predictably hostile results. In 1880, a British naval officer named Maurice Vidal Portman led an armed expedition to the island, captured 6 Sentinelese, including an elderly couple and 4 children, and brought them back to Port Blair, the capital of the Andaman Islands. The elderly couple quickly fell ill and died, likely from exposure to diseases against which they had no immunity. the 4 children were returned to the island with gifts, but the damage was done. The Sentinelese had been given every reason to fear outsiders. In the 1960s and 1970s, Indian anthropologists began a series of contact expeditions, approaching the island by boat and leaving gifts like coconuts, cloth, and metal pots in the shallow water. The Sentinelese sometimes collected the gifts, but more often greeted the boats with a hail of arrows. One of the few peaceful encounters occurred on January 4th, 1991, when a team led by Triloknath Pandit of the Anthropological Survey of India managed to approach the shore and hand coconuts directly to the islanders. A young tribesman initially aimed his bow at the researchers, but lowered his weapon after a woman on the beach nudged him. For a brief moment, there was something resembling communication. But even during these rare, peaceful contacts, no progress was made in understanding the Sentinelese language, and the islanders would quickly become agitated if the visitors stayed too long. The contact expeditions were discontinued in 1997 due to ethical concerns about the risks of exposing the tribe to outside diseases. In January of 2006, 2 Indian fishermen, Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari, were fishing illegally in the waters near North Sentinel Island when their boat drifted too close to the shore while they slept. They were killed by the Sentinelese. An Indian Coast Guard helicopter sent to recover the bodies was met with a volley of arrows and was forced to retreat. The fishermen's bodies were never recovered. And then came the case that would bring North Sentinel Island to global attention. In November of 2018, a 26-year-old American named John Allen Chow traveled to the island with the goal of making contact with the Sentinelese and converting them to Christianity. Chow had spent years preparing for this mission, undergoing medical training, linguistic study, and extensive physical conditioning. He was deeply religious and believed he had been called by God to bring the gospel to what he described in his diary as potentially the last stronghold of evil on earth. He hired local fishermen to transport him close to the island and made multiple attempts to approach the Sentinelese. On his first visit, he offered gifts and sang hymns from his canoe. The islanders responded with hostility, but also, at times, with apparent curiosity and amusement. On one attempt, a young Sentinelese boy shot a metal-tipped arrow that pierced the Bible Chow was holding against his chest. He retreated, but returned the following day. On November 17th, Chow told the fishermen to leave without him. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. The next day, the fishermen observed the Sentinelese dragging a body along the beach and burying it in the sand. Indian authorities made several attempts to recover Chow's remains, but ultimately abandoned the effort, concluding that the risk of a violent confrontation with the islanders was too great. 7 fishermen were arrested for helping Chow reach the island. The death of John Allen Chow sparked a global debate about the ethics of contacting isolated tribes, about religious mission work, and about the rights of indigenous peoples to be left alone. The Indian government reaffirmed its hands-off policy toward the Sentinelese, and the exclusion zone around North Sentinel Island remains firmly in place. The Sentinelese, for their part, seem entirely uninterested in the world's opinions about them. They have survived on their island for tens of thousands of years, through ice ages and tsunamis and the rise and fall of empires. And they have made one thing abundantly clear. They intend to keep surviving, and they intend to do it alone. These places, scattered across the globe, share something in common. They are monuments to the things that happen when the world goes wrong, whether through disease, disaster, war, or simply the unstoppable force of nature. They are reminders that for all our technology, all our ambition, and all our certainty that we can conquer anything, there are still places on this earth that belong to something other than us. Places where the doors are closed, the fences are up, and the world has been told, firmly and permanently, to stay out. Thank you so much for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this journey through some of the world's most forbidden places, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It means everything, and it helps more people find us. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.